I'm Justin Cassio, Mafia Genealogist. If you've seen my other videos, this one's a departure. Instead of focusing on the Mafia half, I'm going to talk today about genealogy and how DNA testing can enrich your understanding of your family's origins. If you're new to genealogy, you may have wondered where to begin looking. What's the best investment of your money and time when it comes to genealogical research? And what tools are going to be the most helpful and in what order? Before there was DNA testing, people traced their family histories using sources like baptismal records, ship manifests, and even tombstones as evidence of who our ancestors were and when, where, and how they lived. We combined these with the study of history to understand these records and our ancestors' lives in their proper context. Now, with the advent of affordable DNA tests, genealogists now have a whole other set of records available to us, written in the cells of our bodies. DNA tests can tell you, among everyone else who's been tested, who's a close relative. DNA can also tell us about something called our admixture, or where in the world our DNA comes from, and in what proportions, by comparing our results with those of people living in those places today. Let me explain admixture a little more because it can get confusing. Each of us gets about half of our DNA from our mother and half from our father. They in turn got half from each of their parents. They're not exactly 50-50 breaks, but pretty close. Close enough that we can talk about how much DNA we get from each one of our grandparents, our great-grandparents, and so forth. All of us have some genes that we share in common with lots of other people, not just with our close relatives. Even though we don't know exactly how we're related, we are, because we all got that gene from one common ancestor a long time ago. When our ancestors left someplace where their families had lived for generations, and where they had lots of relatives, it meant that many more people with that gene did not leave. They stayed, and they had children there, who had children of their own, and today their genes act as geographical markers, pointing to a native population that we share this gene in common with. It's the power of these numbers, of homebodies to travelers, that makes it possible to do admixture research. So what about me? What will my admixture test results tell me? And how far back does it go? I'm a New Yorker. I was born in Suffolk County on Long Island. My parents and their parents were all born in New York, either in the city or out on the island. Richard Brush, who is my ninth great-grandfather on my mother's side, came to America from Nottingham in the Midland region of England and settled on Long Island near what's now Smithtown around 1650. At the same time that Richard Brush was moving to Smithtown, my ninth great-grandfather in my paternal line, Salvatore Locascio, lived in Corleone. I think of Salvatore and Richard as having lived a long, long time ago. Both of them came from the interiors of island nations where their families had probably lived for centuries. But even this isn't where my DNA came from, meaning my DNA more closely resembles the DNA of people from other places in the world. Sicily has been a colony of foreign powers for nearly all of recorded history, going all the way back to the Phoenicians, 2,000 years before the Common Era. Its plantations, which are still visible today, were established by the Romans. In ancient times, there was a series of slave uprisings known as the Servile Wars, and the first two of these revolts against their Roman masters were in Sicily. The third was led by a guy you might have heard of, Spartacus, in mainland Italy. Like much of southern Italy, Sicily passed through nearly a dozen different foreign rulers until the establishment of the Italian Republic in 1860. Many of those rulers permitted slavery, and those slaves came from everywhere that Sicily's rulers or their trade partners went. All of this helps to explain why DNA testing shows that I have roots in North Africa and East Asia, as well as Southern Europe and the Mediterranean. So you can see why my father's contribution to my admixture is not as homogeneous as the paper trail leading to Sicily suggests, because of Sicily's remarkable history. Turning to my mother's side of the family, I learned through both paper trails and DNA testing that her heritage is more complicated than the half German, half English I'd always heard. On 4 of my mother's ancestral lines, our family goes back to ethnic German communities in different parts of Europe. One line goes to Bialyslavia in what was once Prussia and is now the northwest of Poland. Another goes to the former Kingdom of Bavaria in the southeast of modern Germany. One line goes to Hamburg, a port city in the north. And there's another line that I just don't know yet where they came from, just that they're German. 2 of my mother's lines go back to England. One of my twice great-grandmothers was born in Sweden, and in 2 different lines I have a 3rd great-grandmother and a 4th great-grandmother who were both born in Ireland. This is a map prepared for me by Family Tree DNA, and here is the same map with stars that show you where I've traced my origins using old-fashioned, document-based genealogy. The stars are sized roughly in proportion to how much of my genetic inheritance came from each place. Irish is the smallest proportion of my ancestry that I've identified, so Ireland has the smallest star, and I've found equal proportions coming from each of these places marked in Germany and Poland. And of course, half my ancestry comes from Sicily, so it has the biggest star. I tested on another website called GEDmatch, where you can upload test results from any of the major DNA testing companies and reinterpret the results using different data sets and calculations. According to the Eurogenes model on GEDmatch, I have significant amounts of DNA that are Eastern Mediterranean and West Asian. Family Tree DNA breaks it down a little differently and shows that much of my family is from Eastern Europe, Asia Minor, and North Africa. You can see where my Swedish ancestors are represented in Family Tree DNA's map of my global heritage, and this probably explains one of the outliers in the Eurogenes model, this sliver of Siberian DNA here. Where my Scandinavian and Western European ancestry is greater than the paper trail suggests, I imagine that this must be where my English and Irish and even some of my Sicilian ancestors are originally from. As it turns out, DNA testing shows that most people who identify themselves as ethnically English are largely descended from the French, because like Sicily and like New York State, while there is an indigenous population who's been living in England since prehistory, the modern population of England has mostly come from other places in the past 1,000 years or so. Long enough to forget where we're from in many cases, but DNA remembers. We still share the distinctive genes with people who live in those other places, our distant ancestral homes. So you see how my DNA results don't exactly match my genealogical research, but rather complement it. One of the ways this story is so much better than it would be without DNA testing is that I get a much longer story than how my family became Americans. It's also about how we became English, German, and Sicilian. But this long version of my family story would not have been much help to me if I'd tried to use it as my first clue toward finding my American immigrant roots in the Old World. In fact, these admixture results would have led me on a wild goose chase across 3 continents, to places my family may not have lived at any time in recorded history. I'd have a family story that was like a book with whole chapters torn out of the middle. There's chapter 1 from 1,000 years ago written in my DNA, and I know where I am now in modern memory, but I still wouldn't know from these clues how we got from here to there. This way I know much more of the story. So that's why I and most genealogists will tell you not to use just one, but every kind of evidence available to you in your genealogical search to learn the most complete version of your family's history. If you found this video useful, please consider supporting me through Mafia Genealogy on Patreon.